مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. على تويتر عنوان رئيسنا هو دونالد ترامب الحقيقي. فيما يخص السياسة الخارجية، من هو دونالد ترامب الحقيقي؟ هل دونالد ترامب الرجل الذي قامت حملته الانتخابية على إلغاء اتفاق إيران النووي ونقل سفارة الولايات المتحدة إلى القدس ومطالبة السعوديين بدفع مليارات أكثر للأمن؟ أم أن دونالد ترامب الرجل الذي يطبق الآن اتفاق إيران النووي ويبكي سفارة الولايات المتحدة في تل أبيب ويثني على السعودية؟ هل دونالد ترامب الرجل الذي قامت حملته الانتخابية على خفض سلع أمريكا بالناتو وإنهاء الاتفاقيات التجارية مع آسيا والوعد بالبقاء بعيدا عن مستنقع في الشرق الأوسط؟ أم أن دونالد ترامب الرجل الذي أكد على وعد أمريكا بالدفاع عن أوروبا ويعد رئيس الوزراء الياباني واحدا من أفضل أصدقائه ويفكر الآن في إرسال 1000 جندي أمريكي جديد إلى سوريا؟ كل الساسة يقطعون وعودا خلال الحملات الانتخابية ويفعلون شيئا آخر حين يتولون مناصبهم، ولكن بعد شهرين في البيت الأبيض كيف ينبغي أن ينظر العالم إلى رئيسنا الجديد؟ لمناقشة هذه القضية يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية وان زراتي ودينيس روس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today we're with our panel of foreign policy experts to explore the words and actions of President Trump. Gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning.
So President Trump's Twitter handle is Real Donald Trump. So let's look at who is the real Donald Trump by exploring the contrasts and comparisons between what he said during the campaign and what he's done in foreign policy since being in the White House. So far, we've seen him being friendly with the Saudis, hosting the Chinese at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, and he hasn't even met his best friend Vladimir Putin yet. In general, how do you look at overall Trump foreign policy and the move from candidate Trump to President Trump in the first couple of months? Dennis?
Well, I don't think it's totally surprising. I mean, it doesn't matter who the candidate is. They don't always do what they say they're going to do. Once, if for no other reason, once you get in, it turns out that reality isn't quite what you thought. Now, clearly, this president is a little different than his predecessors in terms of being prepared to stake out positions and stick with them even when reality suggests otherwise. Obviously, the issue of the wiretapping of his claim of being wiretapped in Trump Towers is a suggestion where he's prepared to stick with his position regardless. But I do think if you look at the larger policy issues, you've seen a kind of pattern here where, in foreign policy at least, he's been prepared to adjust his behavior. We've seen it in a number of areas. You outlined them. One, China. For a period, he was prepared to raise questions about the one China policy, but that was quietly changed. And a phone call was worked out with Xi Jinping, the Jerusalem embassy. Again, one where he staked out a certain position and now seems to have a position that reflects a different set of considerations. Doesn't mean he may not do it, but he's certainly not rushing to do it. I do think it's a reflection of you get in, you hear what are some of your choices, and then you adopt positions in light of that. I still think he will try, in general, to show that what he's said he will do, he will end up doing.
Juan?
Rob, I actually think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think he has remained consistent in some ways to what he had promised on the campaign trail, but as Dennis said, has had to adjust to actually being president and governing. To give you three examples, he has promised to be more muscular with ISIS. We've begun to see additional troop movements in the Middle East, additional troops being committed to Syria, which is something that the U.S. has been unwilling to do in large measure under the prior administration. The tensions with Mexico, the willingness to build the wall, to sort of insult the Mexicans by suggesting that the Mexicans will have to pay for it. He's not backing away from that, despite the fact that that looks to be an area of unnecessary conflict with a very close neighbor and friend. And then the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the trade deal, the multilateral trade deal in Asia, was a fulfillment of a promise to change our policy on trade and to replace it with bilateral deals. So discussions with the Japanese to see what a deal could look like there, or with the British in the context of their exit from Europe. And so I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag, where you do have a president who is very much committed to demonstrating that he's doing what he's promised, willing to break some China and be disruptive, but at the end of the day, to Dennis's point, is going to actually have to govern longer term, and is going to have a relationship with these countries and with these actors. But I do think it's a mixed bag. So to your question, the real Donald Trump, I think it's a bit of who he was on the campaign trail, and it's a little bit of who he's becoming as president.
Just on this point, when you put this mixed bag together, are you seeing a principle? Are you seeing a fundamental idea that drives what's going on?
I would say yes, but it's related to what I see as the connection between domestic policy and foreign policy. Where he is acting in a way that is consistent with what you saw as a candidate seems to be most related to his domestic priorities. And so on trade, you see him acting in a way that is consistent with what he said throughout the campaign. Again, I think you see with this president a set of priorities in domestic policy that are clear. In foreign policy, it's less clear. And again, I would say even the more muscular approach on ISIS, consistent with what I think is, again, a kind of domestic priority. His domestic priority is to show, I'm going to take care of domestic threats that might come from terror. So he sticks with where he is on the issue of the travel ban. He sticks with where he is on the issue of building a wall. For me, those are very much related to his domestic priorities. So when you look at foreign policy, if you see it connected to a domestic priority, there I think you'll see a kind of consistency.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I think the thematic of America First is sort of the core, mantra of this administration, and certainly could be seen as a core principle. What that means in practice and in translation is a very difficult and complicated question. And so I think, to answer your question, there is a common theme and thread, but how it translates into practice is going to change depending on the context.
Well, if we build on this theme of connecting domestic and foreign, your point about the troops to Syria is fascinating, because there is this general perception that Americans don't want to send soldiers abroad, but yet he is nudging his way towards sending at least another 1,000 to Syria, and maybe this is the beginning of something grander. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think it's a reflection of some of the internal contradictions and tensions. Frankly, it's not new to this administration. It's the question of, when we talk about the exertion of American power and influence, what does that mean at a time when the political consensus and the consensus in the American public is we don't want to be the policeman for the world. We don't want to be overextended. We are a war-weary country. And so there is a dynamic tension there, because in particular with this administration, where the sense of foreign policy seems to be defined through the lens of military power, with a lot of generals and admirals leading the major agencies of the national security establishment. The question then is, what does America First mean if it's not isolationist, if it's more expansionary and it means more military power? There seems to be an internal contradiction there. You have not just the troops in the Middle East, by the way, Rob. You have also a rethinking of policy on North Korea, where the administration has declared that the era of strategic patience is over, that we can no longer allow North Korea to move toward nuclear capabilities that could potentially threaten the U.S. homeland. That suggests, too, with Secretary Tillerson, Secretary of State, saying all options are on the table, suggests a more aggressive, potentially even a more military approach in Asia than we've seen in the past. And so I think what you've described is a manifestation of that internal tension. We want America to be powerful, we want to influence, we want America first, but what does that mean really in practice if all we're talking about is military power and troops in these various contexts.
Dennis?
What's interesting in that regard, if you look historically at those who adopted a kind of more isolationist policy, they were different character, different threads, different instincts. Senator Bora, in many ways, may be a kind of antecedent to President Trump, in the sense that Senator Bora of Idaho was described as a kind of belligerent isolationist. What that meant was he wasn't reluctant to be engaged in the world, but he didn't really want entanglements abroad. He wanted us to be able to decide what were the circumstances under which we would act, and he didn't want us somehow bound or obligated to others. Now, it may well be, if you see a more muscular approach on the outside, it reflects, again, an instinct on the part of the president to show American power, but I don't think to want to get somehow ground down in foreign conflicts. Even the approach in Syria, even though we're talking about a commitment of additional forces, the one thing you're not seeing is the U.S. is going to go in and take over the responsibility. The U.S. is going to go in and nation build. That doesn't seem to be part of any of the discussions here, and by the way, it does open a very big question. I have no doubt that during the course of this coming year, we will see ISIS defeated in Raqqa, we will see ISIS defeated in Mosul. What I don't know necessarily is, do we have a credible plan for what comes afterwards? Do we have a credible plan to ensure that there's reconstruction, that there's inclusion and governance, and that there's security? If we don't have that, or say, for example, in Raqqa, that those who end up playing the leading role in here end up including the Syrians, because we now see the Syrians, the Iranians, and the Russians poised to try to do more in Raqqa. If they do that, the net effect is going to be greater sectarianism, and I think it'll give rise to the son of ISIS.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to discuss the impact of money and personnel on American foreign policy in just a moment. So Juan, before we turn to dollars and people, you brought up North Korea a moment ago. I want to ask you how you think another proliferation challenge, the Iranians, may be viewing what's going on with North Korea and overall Trump administration approach in the Middle East.
Well, I think the Trump administration has actually been incredibly consistent and clear with respect to its Iran policy. And interestingly, has been not about rupturing the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, but has been a policy of suggesting that the U.S. is going to push back both through the deal, maintaining it, and also around the deal to push back against Iranian aggression, support to proxies and terrorist groups, and to change the tenor of the relationship. That is to say, to be less permissive around Iranian behavior. Part of that is a signal to allies in the region that the U.S. is rectifying what has been seen to be the wrong shift in our policy that could be seen to be favoring the Iranians. And you've already seen action by the administration to apply additional sanctions in the context of the existing deal. So that has been incredibly consistent. And now you're seeing a pushback on the North Korean side. And both North Korea and Iran have watched very carefully how the U.S. has postured with respect to each, because it's often a forerunner to how the U.S. will operate. And so if I were in Tehran, I would be seeing this as a warning sign that the administration is willing to be not only more aggressive in pushing back on behavior, but perhaps even more forward-looking in terms of how to contain what is seen as Iranian aggression and even ambitions in the region.
And Dennis, I wanted to ask you about what might be the most counterintuitive Trump administration initiative, the kinder, gentler Donald Trump, right, peacemaker between Israelis and Palestinians. One wouldn't have expected this from Donald Trump.
It is interesting that this seems to be an issue on which he wants to make a difference. To be fair, it's not unusual for American presidents to come in and decide that they're going to be the ones to make peace. Ronald Reagan bears one plan that has his name. It's called the Reagan Plan, September 1, 1982, a peace plan between Israel and the Arab states. And, you know, many presidents have felt somehow, perhaps because this is the birthplace of three great religions, perhaps because it's the Holy Land, something about it creates an attraction for American presidents. In that sense, it doesn't set President Trump off in a different way. It's just not something that necessarily many people would have predicted in advance. But there's no question he seems to be interested in it. Every time he's asked about it, he clearly talks about a big deal, the ultimate deal. So there's something that's driving it, and I do think, as you said, it might not have been expected, but it does seem to be his posture.
Okay, so, gentlemen, with all the speculation we can make about the president's foreign policy, we now have two very clear facts. One is the proposed budget of the administration, cutting the State Department by almost 30%, and the fact that as of today, we're now 60 days into the administration. Other than Secretary Tillerson, there is not one confirmable appointment inside the State Department. What should we make about this combination of dollars and people, and what does it say about the administration's approach? Juan?
I think this in part goes back to one of Dennis's earlier points about domestic policy and political promises. The Trump campaign and the budget team within the administration have committed to right-sizing the government. And much of that is a sense that we need to right-size how we think about aid abroad as opposed to investments in the U.S. And so those things like that are natural national security components that play to the core of some of the Trump administration's promises, like the Department of Defense, like the Department of Homeland Security, are actually getting plussed up, whereas the State Department is almost...
Plussed up is American talk for increased budgets.
Increased budget, so you're getting more money. Whereas, as you said, the State Department is almost at the head of the line in terms of the most budget cuts, right? The Environmental Protection Agency is probably the only other agency of government that will be cut more. Now, that's a signal of both ideology and principles coming out of the White House. But the reality is this, Rob, and for viewers who don't understand the American political process, this is important. The budget isn't just what the president announces or presents. Congress holds the keys to the financial kingdom in the U.S., holds the purse strings. And so Congress will have much to say about this.
He's not trying to create a kinder, gentler instinct. He's not trying to create an American brand based upon the appeal of somehow American culture. He's trying to create an American brand based on the idea of American power. And so I think one of the reasons you're seeing this kind of change in terms of priorities reflects a more muscular approach, which he thinks also will command a kind of respect. I think he does feel that in the aftermath of the Obama years that we lost a kind of standing and respect on the world stage, and one way to reestablish it is by creating an image of harder power, muscular power, much more so than soft power.
Well, speaking about commanding respect through hard power, I wanted to ask you about an issue which hovers over all of this, which is Russia. The many different aspects of the Russia issue in American politics and American foreign policy, but how it plays out in foreign policy for the purposes of our discussion. The president hasn't yet met with Putin. Perhaps that's on the agenda for later this spring, early summer. How do you think the politics of this is impacting this broad strategic question for the administration?
Well, what's fascinating here, Rob, is that even before the heads of state have met, you have so much concentration and attention on Russia, Russia policy, and what I think ultimately, to answer your question, is a constraint on what Russia policy could be. Because the administration came in clearly trying to articulate a rethinking of what that relationship could be. A more cooperative relationship, perhaps, one that would find common interests in countering terrorism and in other areas of cooperation, perhaps even peace in Syria. I think some of those options are now no longer available precisely because of the politics and the tension and some of the radioactivity around Russia in the United States. You have congressional investigations underway tied to what the Russians did to meddle in the U.S. elections. You have law enforcement investigations of potential connections between the Trump campaign or elements of it and Russian agents. And you have a general suspicion around what Russia has done to try to influence this administration, rightly or wrongly. But that mere perception begins to tie the hands of the administration to do anything overly creative, to, for example, lift sanctions or to come up with a grand bargain with Russia. All of that, I think, is very much constrained even before President Trump has his first meeting with Putin.
Okay, with that, we're going to have to leave this conversation. This is still a chapter to be written. We'll come back and have you back here in another month to talk about the next phase of the evolving Trump foreign policy here on Dakhel, Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول التغييرات في السياسة الأمريكية في الشرق الأوسط تحت قيادة رئيسنا الجديد، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.